I just wanted to comment on what's about enclosures. I feel, and perhaps its relation to transport as well, and its relation to Occupy. When Occupy was kind of at its peak, I had a lot of trouble getting down there. I wasn't camping there, and it cost a lot of money. And I think once people are prevented from moving, they're prevented from communicating and creating movements. And it strikes me that the trains are what you've just described, and our ability to be able to move throughout the country and also throughout, just even London. It's £8 really for me to get to Occupy and back. And also just strikes me as a clear target, that it's something that's attainable.
Sure, well, I mean, I think a very a just and sensible policy is to press the Labour Party to make good its long-standing commitment to renationalise the railways. The case is very clear, and we've seen the appalling mess that's been made of the enclosure of the railways, the privatisation of the railways by John Major's government, at a point at which British Rail had finally got its act together and was really beginning to do a very good job. And yes, you're quite right. I mean, this is something a bit like the rivers. The railways, they flow through our country. You look at a map of the country, you would think they belong to everybody because they pass by everybody's door. But their fruits are harvested entirely by a tiny group of people whose interests are at variance with ours.
And being a frequent traveller on the trains, I also noticed that there's plenty of place for the 1% in their first class, and second class is always absolutely packed in like sardines. Right. Okay, the second question.
George Osborne's got a solution to that.
Thanks very much, George. Very good description of a particular event that's now happening in London, which is Thames Water's building of a super sewer. They've taken over the land under the ground, and if the scheme goes ahead, it's given planning permission, then their assets will increase by 40%. And then they will own the water, and they will own all that goes with it. So it's a very good example. Now the second point is that this is a very good example of where one decision can focus the whole issue. Because the one decision is whether this tunnel is given planning permission or not. It can be stopped. It can be stopped. Absolutely. And the alternative, which is a better solution, it solves 4 problems rather than 1. The tunnel doesn't solve the problem.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the word planning, because that's something I forgot to talk about. And of course, you raised one example of the many planning issues that we've got. And planning is something else which is very clearly being enclosed. This was something which belonged to everybody. It's one of those rights over the land that we have. Even if you don't own that piece of land, you've got a right to have a say about what goes on in that land. And that was one of those common rights, a bit like sort of being a game like Sylvester's or Toby or something, one of those common rights to actually have some effect on land which technically does not belong to you, although that aspect, that right belongs to us. And that, of course, is being sharply, very quickly terminated in many ways by this government, and indeed by the previous government with its major infrastructure stuff. But this government talking about the presumption in favour of sustainable development, and then reclassifying every single kind of development as sustainable. They have yet to publish a list of what is not sustainable development. Roads are sustainable, airports are sustainable, mines are sustainable, everything is supposedly sustainable development. So it's an utterly meaningless term, of course. And what they've just done is effectively disenfranchise people who want to have a say in the planning process, and give that right back to the owners of the land. And that's a classic enclosure. It's as clear a case of enclosure as the creation of a royal forest, that basically you're terminating the rights which other people used to exercise over that land. And that's a way in which I see this. I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that I see this issue of enclosure as a lens through which one can understand a lot of what's been going on in this country for the past 1,000 years, and that is still going on today.
Thank you. Another question.
Thanks. The talk is pretty much at the national level, and as you just said, and any change in the context would be national change in regulation. But I've long seen international trade agreements as an actual meta level of enclosure, because that's where states' actual right to regulate is prevented in favour of corporate rights, global corporate rights. So as corporate, and that becomes fixed into international law beyond the nation state. And it's not discussed very much or known about very much. So intellectual property at that international level is obviously enclosure, but there's another thing, particularly in trading services, states' right to regulate. So that obliterates the level that is being discussed here. So there is that meta level going on in a very real sense into international law.
You're absolutely right, and it's a kind of political enclosure where effectively multinational corporations, most of which are based in the West, are determining the political limits of other countries and capturing the democratic rights.
It's not just a developing country issue at all.
Yeah, well, indeed, and in this country, but they're basically taking political rights that belong to all of us and enclosing them for their own use. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's worth noting again that Britain was very largely responsible for the export of the enclosure model to other parts of the world. The way that the British managed their colonies was very much through the ethic of enclosure, taking over the land, calling it theirs, allocating a few residual rights to the people who lived in them, but all the wealthy stuff flowed through British hands, and then terminating the political rights. Of course, the post-colonial settlement is still an imperialistic one, effectively, for the very reasons that you say. And what was previously done with gunboats is now done with trade agreements. And we've been fighting opium wars ever since, effectively. But as you also point out, these wars are now fought against us too, because we find that democracy has been curtailed everywhere on earth for the sake of multinational capital. And that these trade agreements, trade-related intellectual property rights is a very obvious example of it, where you're effectively allowing multinational corporations to capture the sort of intellectual wealth that has been accumulated over many, many generations of people who call it their exclusive property. But in so many ways, by terminating the political, the democratic rights of people living within every nation on earth, and saying you cannot challenge our rights of ownership of just about everything, they're effectively granting themselves this massive legal enclosure, this metaphorical enclosure of almost all the world's assets. And that's a great loss that every one of us suffers, even if we don't recognize day to day the extent to which we're suffering it, because this is a subtle erosion which takes place all the time of what it is to be human and what it is to have a share in the running